Here I have defined several buttons: an ordinary one repeat button, one toggle button, and toggle buttons inheritors, checkbox, and a couple of radio buttons. The main purpose of a button is to be able to be clicked. I've already attached click event handlers for all buttons. Let's look inside those handlers. Each handler just prints the line which says about which button was clicked. Here and here, and the toggle button. Okay, let's run the application and look at the output window. I click once on the ordinary button, and while I'm holding the left mouse button, we don't see anything in the output window. This is because the click event of an ordinary button fires up after releasing the mouse button. I release the left mouse button and we see in the output window that the event was fired. Here we see that. Yeah. Repeat button works differently. I click it, and while I'm holding the left mouse button, we see that the click event occurs repeatedly until I release the left mouse button. I've released the left mouse button and you see that repeat button has stopped generating click events. We see that many events have been fired. Toggle button is rarely used by itself. Mostly, toggle button acts as a base class for other controls such as checkbox and radio button. Clicking on toggle button works as with the regular button. Click event fires immediately after the mouse button is released. Yeah, we see here. But you can see that toggle button after releasing the mouse button stays pushed or clicked if you want. You see that the background of this button is not gray. Toggle button provides isChecked property, which is of nullable boolean type. And what is very important is that it provides is3state property. If this property is set to true, then isChecked property can be set to one of three values: true, false, and null. And the default value will be false. If is3state set to false, then isChecked can be set to true or false, and by default it also will be set to false. Now this button's isChecked property is set to true, because we see that this button stays pushed or clicked. If I click it once again, isChecked property turns false. And you see that button is released. This behavior makes perfect sense for its inheritors, which by their appearance mean that they can be checked or in other words selected. Okay, let's stop the running application. Let's take a step back and consider an important concept. What I want to address concerns all content controls we will ever see in WPF. I'm talking about the content model. And I want to show what content model is by using button's content property. As you see, I've initialized the content property of an ordinary button by the string ordinary button. But actually, content controls, button is a content control of course, has a content property of type object that contains a single item. Because of that, content controls can have only one direct child, and this child can be arbitrarily complex. For example, I can insert a stack panel with an ellipse and a text block. Let's do it. Let's expand button, and I'll just copy and paste it. As you see now, the content of this button contains a stack panel with an ellipse and a text block. When an element is a content control, all content inserted between opening and closing tags is implicitly assigned to the content property. So what we've done here with the stack panel is the absolute equivalent for the explicit setting of content. Let's expand the content property in XAML explicitly. Button.content and close it right here. As you see, the content can contain an arbitrarily complex objects, and here we set the content explicitly. Okay, let's move further. Checkbox and radio button are pretty simple controls. They derive from the toggle button class, so they expose isChecked and is3state properties. When you select either a checkbox or a radio button, its isChecked property turns true. Unselecting or unchecking makes it false. Checked and unchecked events are separated. For tracking the third state, called indeterminate, there's a separate event named correspondingly, indeterminate, and this event's signature is identical to the signature of checked and unchecked events. Despite of that, I've attached a separate handler for this event. You can see it here. I've attached the same handler for checked and unchecked events and a separate one for the indeterminate. Radio button is another example of the toggle button inheritor. Radio button's feature is the mutual exclusion. There is only one button can be checked at the same moment. Usually, radio buttons are grouped by a container, such as a stack panel. Radio buttons which share the same logical parent, in this case you can see this is a stack panel, become a group with the mutual exclusion among them. Before we run the application, I want also to mention that checkbox's is3state property is set to true. Here it is. What means that this checkbox can be in 3 different states. Our radio button 1 sets is3state explicitly to false, what is the same as not to set it at all, because false is a default value for this property. Both checkbox and radio buttons handle checked and unchecked events. Checkbox, in addition, as I've already mentioned, handles the indeterminate event. Let's look at the implementation of these handlers. Checked, unchecked, and indeterminate event handlers have a very similar implementation. I explicitly cast the sender to the base class of radio button and checkbox, to the toggle button class, and then I write a line which says which control state was changed and what is the current value of this checked property. Let's run the application and look at the output window. I run the application and now we see the output window. I click the checkbox and we see in the output window that isChecked turned true. I click it again and now it's null. It is in the indeterminate state. I click it once again and now it's false. Yeah, we see this in the output window. Let's examine the radio buttons. If I click the first one, you see that now it's checked and the output window acknowledges this fact. I check the second one, and what you can see now is that the first one was unchecked and only after that the second one was checked. Great, we've taken a look at buttons. Let's get acquainted with header content controls.